what in you is dying and what in you is being reborn? That's a self-inquiry question that I love to ask people. So talk to us about the spiritual crisis that this leads to, this collective amnesia, and how this can also bring us hope because we're able to really change. What I hear you saying is we're 3D printing ourselves. We have the opportunity to change and shift
Mm.
our future.
What we're experiencing is a rapid forgetting of our true nature. And I think when I speak of this forgetting um, of our true nature, it is a forgetting of the concept of ecosystems, of the fact that we are totally interdependent and totally related on the material, energetic, I would say spiritual level with everything else in the universe. And I think the way I really think about it all boils down to a Taoist phrase and concept, which is we have forgotten that we are a process, not an entity. And so we think of ourselves as bodies, as humans, as entities, as a thing. I'm a Casey, I'm a thing. You're a Tracy. You're Tracy. You're a Tracy, a thing, and it's like that couldn't be farther from the truth. If we could actually like change the filter of our eyes and see what's actually true, we'd realize that we were just these buzzing hives of atoms that are constantly in flux with everything else around us. And that we are constantly dying and we are constantly being reborn.
Welcome, Dr. Casey.
Thank you so much for having me, Tracy.
Oh, thank you for being here. Wow, this book, Get Good Energy. This book, Good Energy, it feels like this is right on time for us. At least I know right on time for me personally. And there's so many concepts in this book that I want to dive into because I think it's really important for us to kind of reframe how we think about our health. But first, I want to ask you to define metabolic health because this is what
Mm,
this book is all about. And it's a term that I haven't heard often.
mm. Metabolic health on its surface, metabolic health is the study of how we convert food to energy in our bodies. So we take in 2 to 3 pounds of food every single day into our bodies, 70 metric tons of food in our lifetime. And one of the purposes of all that material is to be converted to a type of energy that our bodies can use to do all the chemical reactions that we have to do every day that ultimately bubble up into our lives. So it's food energy to cellular energy. It's a transformation of currency of energy from one that the cosmos has to the one that our body can use. So that's kind of fundamentally it's a set of chemical reactions that change the form of energy to one that humans can use. I think on the deeper and more incredible level, it's we can really think of metabolism as how we are actually converting light energy to consciousness, which is what gets me really excited about it because fundamentally, the light that travels from the sun 92 million miles through space and farther if it's coming from other stars. It is taken up by the chloroplasts of plants, and that light energy is actually stored in the bonds, the carbon carbon bonds that plants make carbohydrates from. And then that energy is ultimately taken up by humans or taken up by animals that we might eat, and it's liberated inside our bodies into a form of energy that we're able to use to power this physical form that we have that is having this wonderful incredible experience of duality. So metabolism is both a scientific concept and a set of chemical reactions, but it's also a really, I think, broader miraculous uh phenomenon that ultimately is about how humans liberate light to power our hopefully our highest self and our highest purpose in this lifetime.
I love this explanation. So this brings forward two things for me that I want to ask you about. So, one, as a student of spiritual ecology, one of the things that we often talk about is how the disconnection from nature is the root cause of our suffering, of all of the illnesses that we have, mental illness, our discomfort, our pain in life. And how does that relate? Because what I hear you saying is that these two things are directly related.
Oh, this is the most perfect and beautiful question because I think what you're getting at is what I believe is truly like the crux of the chronic disease epidemic that we're facing today, which is that we have, over the past very short period of time, in such a profound way, separated ourselves from nature. And the way that is translating into cellular dysfunction and metabolic dysfunction in the human body is so vast and profound. And I think of all the conversations we're having in healthcare around biohacking and around longevity protocols and micro optimizations, the thing that we're missing is really like the forest for the trees, is that this human body that has 40 plus trillion human cells, 100 trillion plus bacterial cells, all those cells are looking for specific pieces of information to be able to function properly. And that information largely comes from the relationship between us and the environment around us, whether it's light energy, thermal energy, food energy. And so when those signals change as drastically as they have in the past 100 years, as we've moved to an industrialized diet, become totally separated from how our food is produced and how it even gets to us, separated from the sunlight because we are spending less than 2 hours outdoors per 24-hour period as modern Americans, separated from even thermal signals like heat and cold that we used to experience by being outside. Now we have a thermoneutral existence. So all the sort of cycles and naturalness and connection with nature has changed. And fundamentally, that's a change in the signals our cells are getting about how to function. So I think really at its core, the chronic disease epidemic that we're facing right now is actually just mass confusion of our cells because everything that they were expecting to get has now changed. And that is fundamentally because we have separated ourselves from nature. And what we really have separated ourselves from, which I think is why it feels so, we can think of this chronic disease epidemic as sort of with compassion and sort of with a sense of heartbreak, is that um, we have actually just fundamentally separated ourselves from our source.
Right.
And that is why there's so much suffering and pain, because the source for us is the earth and it's the sun.
Mm.
And we don't connect with the earth or the sun anymore. We have actually, in so many ways, there has been a narrative of actually demonizing those things. The first thing we think of that with the sun is skin cancer. The first thing
Mm.
we think of is sunburns. We think of
Mm.
sunscreen. Everything is about protecting yourself from the sun. And then you think about dirt. It's like we've got kids today who the second they get dirt on their hands, it's, wash your hands. It's dirty. It's dirty. And it's very much almost like a demonization. And I think what is so important for all of us to do as part of this journey back to health for the human species and all life on the planet, because we're all interconnected, we're all interdependent, is to really be meditating on the just sheer reality of the fact that we not only came from the earth, but we're going back to the earth.
Right.
And the energy that's powering all our feelings and thoughts and ability to be productive and work is actually just liberated light energy. And so if you're going to put yourself in a box, which is what we're doing, we're literally physically enclosing ourselves inside these structures, these houses all day long. Over 93% of our time is spent inside a box. What's going to happen when we're separated from our source? There's going to be pain, there's going to be suffering. Um, and it's like you take a baby animal or a baby child away from their mother and they will rapidly get sick and get ill and in some cases they will die, and that's sort of what we're doing to ourselves by separating ourselves from our source. So I think on every level, and it's not about going back in time, it's not about going back to the good old days, it's about just recognizing the signals that our bodies need to be able to express their genetics, their cellular
Mm,
reactions, their chemical reactions that ultimately, you know, funnel into a happy and healthy and vibrant life, and give them to the cells. And that brings us back to essentially eating real food, touching the ground, being outdoors, breathing fresh air, drinking clean water, and moving much
mm,
more throughout the day.
mm. So there's so much there. One of the things that really hits me is when you talk about this demonization, it is really a byproduct of the overculture, right? It's the byproduct of colonization. It's the byproduct of that disconnection of the moment that the light bulb was invented and everybody felt like they needed to keep doing and doing and doing in order to be valuable. Which is a lot of the time we talk about this in the rest world, right? It's like we're talking about how we can let go of the doing. Um, and also this affects marginalized communities even more, right? So what I guess my question to you is, how does this demonization kind of give life to the diet culture and the exercise culture and the things that we do that we think are making us more healthy because we're kind of being sold this narrative that this is how you become healthy?
Mm,
And in fact, what it sounds like you're saying is it's actually maybe these things could be moving us away from health because we need
mhm,
to be closer to the earth and
mm,
cultivate a relationship with the earth.
mm, mm. Yeah, I think at its core, like what we're experiencing is a rapid forgetting of our true nature.
Hmm.
And I genuinely think that, like, step one of reversing the monumental chronic disease epidemic we're facing in this country, which, as you said, disproportionately, so disproportionately affects marginalized communities and people of color, and especially children in those communities, where sometimes the chronic disease rates of these preventable lifestyle conditions are double what they are in white communities. It's actually astronomical. And I think when I speak of this forgetting um of our true nature, it is a forgetting of the concept of ecosystems, of the fact that we are totally interdependent and totally related on the material, energetic, I would say spiritual level with everything else in the universe. And I think the way I really think about it all boils down to a Taoist phrase and concept, which is of what we've forgotten, which is that we have forgotten that we are a process, not an entity. And so we think of ourselves as bodies, as humans, as entities, as a thing. I'm a Casey, I'm a thing. You're a Tracy. You're Tracy. You're a Tracy, a thing, and it's like that couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but in the sense that if we could actually like change the filter of our eyes and see what's actually true, we'd realize that we were just these buzzing hives of atoms that are constantly in flux with everything else around us. And that we are constantly dying and we are constantly being reborn. I'll never forget when I was taking my histology class in medical school, which is where you're looking at cells and tissues under the microscope and you're looking at different human tissues of like a liver or a heart or whatever. And what you see very clearly is that at any given moment, many of the cells on that slide of what was a living, quote unquote, living human are actually dying and actually being reborn. And that's happening constantly. And then also remembering that every single day, you are sort of 3D printing yourself from food. That's what's happening. When you're eating, you're just giving your body ink to 3D print the version of you of tomorrow, and then discarding pounds and pounds of yourself every month back into the cosmos. And so this illusion of self, this material self, is literally just a limitation of our visual capabilities and of our sensory capabilities. And I think if we really internalized that, like truly internalized that, we would realize how ridiculous it is that we want to, sacrifice giving ourselves, you know, beautiful building blocks and substrates of our future self through food just for the sake of convenience, and for the sake of saving 10 minutes here and there. Like,
Right.
because we just have forgotten that we are constantly evolving. Like, you learn these things in medical school, like, oh, you shed your gut lining, the entire gut lining, you discard and rebuild every 6 weeks.
Mm.
Similar things with your skin. And you just sort of you hear that and it's so sterilized and it's so desanctified the way it's taught that you don't really internalize what is being said, which is exactly what the Taoists and so many other spiritual
Mhm.
traditions have said, is that we are a process, not an entity. We're a process that started at the Big Bang. And, you know, this matter has been hurling through space for billions of years, and we're just sort of a little swirl in that's a tumbleweed in the universe that happens to channel consciousness for a brief period of time. Like, I think when I get to that, it feels so antithetical to that understanding, to a disrespect this miracle of life that I am, and b sort of want to do anything but cultivate and support choices that honor that incredible reality that's happening. And so that to me is a core foundation of what like motivates me to go to the farmers market, because I want to put substances in me that are going to help print essentially like the most functional next version of myself, and kind of um you know yeah, cultivate health ultimately. And I think there's just been such an incredible hubris that we have developed as humans as part of the forgetting, which is this hubris of efficiency and such a limited view on the idea of efficiency. And I think it has its hands intermingled with, in a sense, capitalism, because as we've really move towards this idea of like we have quarterly investment reports. It's all about the quarterly returns. And so we do anything on these short time frames to squeeze out what we would call productivity to meet
Mhm.
these projections. And in doing that, we lose the understanding of long-term productivity. I mean, I hate that word in general, but we're so short-sighted that we lose the big picture of like, yeah, maybe we got these tiny little spikes every quarter, but what if we could build a mountain in 2 years by just chilling out and actually allowing, inspiration to truly flow through us? And we see this in so many elements of our culture, that we live in a cyclical world. We are, as women, we are cyclical beings. We have 4 phases to our menstrual cycle. We have follicular, we have ovulation, we have luteal, we have menstrual, the moon, we've got the quarter moons, the full moon, new moon, we've got the tides, we've got spring, summer, fall, winter. Everything is cycles. And unfortunately, for the sake of efficiency and because
Mhm.
of our hubris, we have decided that the yin period of those cycles is inefficient. So we don't like winter, we don't like night, we don't like menstrual, we don't like the periods of essentially what we think of as less productivity. And we actually think we're smart for trying to squeeze more out of the
Right.
yin periods of all these cycles. So it's the light bulb. We don't need night.
Yeah, we're
It's
trying to
industrial
trick ourselves, right?
Strict nature. We've got
Yeah,
industrial agriculture. We
yeah.
don't need winter. We've got birth
Mhm.
control pills. We don't need menstrual cycle. We can just literally plow through it. And what happens when you break cycles? Everything falls apart. Like the cycles are what create harmony, and harmony is what ultimately leads to long-term sustainability. And in our hubris and forgetting, we have decided to break cycles because we are afraid of yin. We are afraid of inefficiency. And that, I think, literally is the root of why we have a chronic disease epidemic, because we don't realize that you can't have summer, you can't have ovulation, you can't have day if you don't have these periods. And so we've overworked ourselves, we've we've prioritized convenience, we've prioritized lack of rest, we've prioritized being inside to work all day, and we're falling apart. And that's really, I think, the root of our chronic disease epidemic.
Mm. And I just also want to tie in this idea of the spiritual crisis, because what I'm also hearing you say, first of all, I don't hear any doctors really speaking the way that you're speaking and talking about the and anchoring this understanding of our own health in this wider um, understanding of the universe and the cosmos, which is so important. And so, we think about a lot of times these ideas around impermanence, right, in spirituality. And the fact is, and I say this often, that you and I are both closer to dying, and anybody else who's listening to this, than we were when we started this podcast. And yet we continue to try to pretend that this is not happening. And that definitely leads to the collective amnesia. And it's almost like if you're not in the flow of the collective amnesia, there's something wrong with you. You're an outlier. And so thank you for speaking to these things, because they're so important. And I think that the productivity that we've been talking about is so often equated with our worth, right? It's that if we're resting, if we're observing these yin times, if we're wintering, oh, you must be lazy. You're not worth anything. How are you surviving? You're not doing anything. So can you just connect us also to how this lack of understanding represents this spiritual crisis? And at the same time, what I'm hearing from you, just on another note, and these are kind of two different things, this idea that we're constantly dying and constantly being reborn, right? That's a self inquiry question that I love to ask people, is like, what in you is dying and what in you is being reborn? Because we've all died and been reborn a million times. How many times have we had to reinvent ourselves? But what I feel in that, when I hear that, is this hope
Mm.
as well. It's like I have a 3D printer in my house, and I see my stepson going and putting in the resin, which would be the food, and he does it overnight, and I can hear it going zzz, 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 zzz in the morning when I wake
Mhm.
up and make my tea. So talk to us about the spiritual crisis that this leads to, this collective amnesia, and how this can also bring us hope, because we're able to really change. What I hear you saying is we're 3D printing ourselves. We have the opportunity to change and shift
Mm.
our future.
Oh, this is such a beautiful question. I personally, I think that like, the field of study that I'm focused on, right, is metabolism. But
Mhm.
ultimately, the conversation between metabolism and death is both so interesting and so philosophical. It's also, like you said, so hopeful. Um, yeah, I think you bring up such a beautiful point, Tracy, that I think is actually so important for the writing of the healthcare conversation and the healthcare system, which is really meditating so much more deeply than we, I think, do as a culture on death and having intense curiosity for it, like so many other cultures have had. And I think the collective amnesia, such a crux of it in the US and the Western world, is this absolute existential fear about death and a allowing of that lack of engagement, lack of curiosity, lack of framework, um, and fear of it to basically be the invisible hand that dictates every decision of our lives, which ultimately lead us to intense consumerism and materialism. Because without a framework for the big D death, the end of this physical incarnation, we are basically essentially trying to plug these leaky buckets of existential fear every second of every day. And I think that that is a huge driver of our very intervention based healthcare system, because essentially what the healthcare system has done, and what I so clearly saw as a surgeon, was that we actually whether we like it or not, whether we know it or not, we weaponize the Western fear of death against patients to get them to do anything. And so the way the financial incentives of our healthcare works is that, healthcare is the largest and growing industry. Healthcare is the largest and fastest growing industry in the United States. And the way that healthcare continues to grow as a business is that more things get done to more people over a longer period of time. It's not that people get healthier, it's that more things get done to more people over a long period of time, which sadly is why a sick, chronically ill child is the most profitable thing for the American healthcare system, because they will be treated for the longest period of time. That's an aside. But in that system, one of the ways that we can get people to take more pills, get more procedures, get more surgeries is by holding the carrot in front of them that maybe, just maybe, this will somehow prevent you from death. This is somehow your key to immortality. And that gets used on every level every day in every American hospital. You think about that incredible power imbalance between the doctor and the patient, where the patient's petrified, the doctor has something that they are able to offer, and the elephant in the room is that that patient is ultimately petrified of death. And I think that, in the American way, very secular, very much like divorced from some of the frameworks of thinking about the true eternal spiritual infinite nature of the human spirit, and thinking of just sort of this time here. If you think about like other traditions potentially that may have more comfort with death, like imagine if we thought of the body like collectively as this, miraculous physical process, this swirl that's just essentially a radio tower for the spiritual world for a brief period of time, for our consciousness as a collective spiritual frequency to evolve, to experience itself through ourselves. And it's just a beautiful miracle. And then our spirits will go back to their true source of pure blissful love, that is pure light. And like in that type of framework, it's the ultimate easing of existential fear. And I will just be totally frankly honest, that's how I look at life. That is literally how I look at things. And so, I mean, I don't want to say that I'm not afraid of death, but I feel very unable to be controlled by the healthcare system on sort of an unconscious fear level, because I genuinely believe that, that this is a just sort of really interesting, delightful, miraculous experience of duality. And, I really have nothing to fear. Because at the end of this experience of duality, like, is reconnecting with source and pure light and love. And so, it's just interesting how in the despiritualization of our culture, it has fed, I think, just like total and utter fear that turns us into obsessive consumers who
Mm.
live smaller than we could because we don't understand our limitless eternal nature. And I don't know how to get that sort of more into, I don't know if I see a world in which that sort of becomes a part of the healthcare conversation. But what I do see is people feeling lost right now. I think
Mm.
that everyone kind of knows that something's not quite right in the way that we're living. We're in the quote unquote most prosperous, wealthiest country in the world, and 40% of people have right now a diagnosed mental health disorder. Like something's not right. There's something
Mm.
that just doesn't feel right in our world and in our culture. And I just don't think there's any biohack or optimization protocol or longevity book that's going to really get us to cross that delta. I believe that it's going to be a spiritual journey. And I see a lot of people kind of going towards that. And I think that's really hopeful. But, one really interesting thing about metabolism, just a separate piece about sort of death and metabolism, like I think one really interesting thing to realize is that essentially death is the total absence of metabolism. Metabolism is the power of our life force. Metabolism is how we power our lives.
Mm.
And without metabolism happening, the food to energy conversion, our body would just, it wouldn't have any force to hold it together. So we would just go into the earth and melt into a atomic puddle, and that's what death is. So it is that channeling of light energy through food energy through our mitochondria liberated into ATP that ultimately keeps us together as this illusion of self, and that kind of holds us together. And right now, we're dealing with a metabolic crisis in the United States where 93.2% of American adults, based on recent data, have metabolic dysfunction, have some issue with this metabolic process. And so, if you think about it, everything we do in our life, which is pretty much everything in Western culture, to hurt our mitochondria, to damage this physical structure that liberates, cosmic energy to human energy, anything we do to hurt that is essentially making us a little more dead while we're alive.
Mm,
And that really motivates me. So it's like when I go out first thing in the morning and look at the sun to basically set up, signal to my suprachiasmatic nucleus to start expressing the daytime metabolic genes, I'm not doing that because it's a biohack. I'm doing it because I don't want to have one foot in the grave while I'm alive. I want to
right.
do what I can to empower these miraculous structures within to liberate more light energy into human energy. When I'm eating real food from the farmer's market, that's what I'm thinking about. When I'm going to bed at 10 p.m. instead of screwing around till midnight, that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about how can I be a more effective transformer of cosmic energy to human energy so that I'm not essentially a little bit more dead in
Mm,
this super brief period while I'm alive. So if we're afraid of death, the best thing we can do is not be more dead while we're alive, which means orienting towards metabolic health. And to me, that feels really simple. But again, collective amnesia, mass forgetting,
mhm.
so much hubris, so much fear, so much victim consciousness, total forgetting of our limitless eternal nature. And so we live small. We give away our power to the healthcare system, and we buy into the cult of productivity and therefore choose convenience over true health.
Yeah.
And we end up essentially getting the thing that we're most afraid of, which is death while we're alive.
Yeah. The convenience culture is really so harmful. I mean, I see that even in my own house with sometimes things that people will walk in with. I'm like, no, we're not doing this. So I'd love to ask you, just so that people who are learning about metabolic health for the first time, what are some of the signs that our metabolic function isn't working? What are some of the signs that we are dead while we're alive?
Well, there's a couple different ways that you can kind of look into it. I mean, the most basic is to actually just look at the 5 biomarkers that essentially define this concept of metabolic syndrome. And in the studies that I'm mentioning, where I said 93% of people have a metabolic issue, they're essentially looking at these criteria and seeing if people meet the quote unquote normal range
Mm,
without being on medication. So the 5 that are basically used are HDL cholesterol, fasting glucose, triglyceride level, blood pressure, and waist circumference. And if people are in the optimal ranges on all of those things, and not on medications, that's essentially that's considered metabolic health. And so just to give people the numbers. So if you have a fasting glucose below 100 milligrams per deciliter, that's considered essentially optimal and metabolically healthy. A waistline of less than 35 inches for women and less than 40 inches for men, in HDL cholesterol, which is the quote unquote good cholesterol, of more than 40 milligrams per deciliter for men and more than 50 milligrams per deciliter for women, triglyceride levels below 150 milligrams per deciliter, and a blood pressure of less than 130 over 85. So basically, all those are generally like free tests on our annual physical. One involves a tape measure, one involves a blood pressure cuff, and then 3 blood biomarkers. And if you kind of go back to maybe your last year's tests, you could probably look in an electronic health record and just look to see if all 5 of those are in the healthier range. not on medication, that's considered being basically part of that 6.8% of optimally metabolically healthy. I hate to say it, like I don't, because that's already hard to meet, that those actually are very lenient ranges. And I'd actually make them much tighter based on my understanding of the literature. So it, like I said, fasting glucose less than 100 is considered optimal.
Mhm.
But what the research actually shows is that a fasting glucose of 70 to 85 is optimal. Similarly for triglycerides, less than 150 is considered optimal, but actually less than 100, I'm sorry, less than 150 is considered normal. But what we know is actually less than 100 is where the real best health outcomes are. So I would actually guess that like less than probably 2% of
Mm,
America actually is
mm,
optimally metabolically healthy, which is wild, you know? And these things are all mostly determined by lifestyle, not genetics. And so that's one way is the biomarkers, but I think more broadly, the other thing to know about it is that like 9 of the 10 leading causes of death in the United States are fundamentally rooted in metabolic issues. And so when you look at like Alzheimer's, dementia, cancer, type 2 diabetes, stroke, heart attack and heart disease, chronic liver disease, when you actually they all, you know, they all seem like different diseases. And when you
mm,
read them on the CDC website of top 10 causes of death, you're like, oh gosh, there's all these different things. It's crazy that all these different diseases are rising at the same time. But what's so fascinating about metabolic science is that when you actually look at what the cellular disturbances are that are happening in each of these diseases, it's actually the same thing for all of them. It's
mm,
a problem with mitochondrial function. It's a problem with how the cell makes energy. And the reason they look like all these different diseases is because there are 200 cell types in the body. There's all these different cell types. There's retinal cells, and there's astrocytes, and there's glial cells, and there's ovarian theca cells, and there's endothelial cells of the blood vessels, and there's, you know, there's muscle cell. There are all these cells. And basically, if any of those cells are underpowered, i.e., have metabolic dysfunction, which is something that happens, you know, all over the body, where it shows up, where that underpowering shows up, will show up as dysfunction because an underpowered cell can't do its work. So, an
mm,
underpowered brain cell is going to have a different symptom than an underpowered ovarian theca cell. So, one might look like polycystic ovarian syndrome, and one might look like Alzheimer's dementia or depression or chronic pain based on where it's showing up. So, this silo view of health was sort of created when we didn't have the understanding of the cellular mechanisms of disease. So we described diseases based on their symptomatology. But now, in the past 20 years, we've come to be able to see really inside the cell what's actually happening. And for most symptoms and diseases in the US today that we are dealing with, what's happening inside the cell is actually quite consistent. And that is basically mitochondrial dysfunction leading to what's called insulin resistance, a problem with how cells take up glucose to make energy.
mm,
Because the cells are dysfunction, the mitochondria are dysfunctional. They can't convert it because they're broken because of our modern lifestyles, and so the cells actually become insulin resistant. This leads to, you know, rising blood sugar levels and things like that, and fundamentally this swirl of metabolic issues that shows up as all these different diseases. So what I would say is for people trying to understand if they have metabolic dysfunction, it's look at those biomarkers I mentioned, those 5 biomarkers, and then look at your symptoms and basically say, what is going on in my body? And I have a symptom questionnaire in the book that basically, you know, you can go through and what's interesting is a lot of people I think are walking around saying, "Oh, I'm pretty healthy," you know, but
right.
actually they've got knee pain and they get migraines and they have really bad perimenopausal symptoms and they're feeling a little anxious
Mm,
and their back is always flaring up and they tend to have bloating after certain meals and, you know, they're constipated. And it's like we have just normalized basically having a bunch of these like random annoying symptoms. And I think that what's really important to realize is that symptoms are this signal from the body
mm,
that cells are not having their needs met. And just like a baby cries when it doesn't have its needs met, our cells express symptoms when they aren't having their needs met. And not having their needs met means that they will be dysfunctional, and dysfunction is symptoms. Symptoms never arise out of thin air. They can't. They are necessarily a result of cellular dysfunction. And what the core cellular dysfunction that's happening in the Western world due to our industrialized living is metabolic dysfunction. So that's really the key. It's not necessarily the thing that's leading to all these conditions, but it is absolutely the number one thing that is causing dysfunction in American bodies today and should be investigated pretty much for everyone who has almost any symptom or disease
Mm,
to make sure that that's optimized because it is controllable, it is modifiable, it is reversible. So it's very empowering. So everyone, basically everyone, should go down the path of understanding if they're metabolically healthy or not. And the easiest way to do that is to just check those 5 basic biomarkers.
wow. Thank you. I know that in the book you have 6 principles of good energy. Can you talk about that so that at least as people are listening to this and we're waiting for the book to arrive in May, we can actually start bringing some of these principles into our lives and looking to see where we might be out of alignment with them.
Hmm. Yeah. So in the book, I present essentially 6 principles of good energy eating, which is essentially the way that I look at food. I think we have gotten so lost in our food conversation for a couple reasons. One is that a majority of the nutrition research that's being done today is being funded by processed food companies, so it's
Mhm.
very difficult to understand the results. And I think a really interesting thing to realize for people who over 50% of Americans say that they are extremely confused about nutrition. So that's one thing to start. And I think one thing to really understand is that the more nutrition research we do in the United States, the worse our health outcomes are getting. So that's really something to think about. The more research we're doing, the worse the outcomes are getting. And I think the point I want to make here is trust yourself, trust your common sense. We have become so petrified to make our own decisions about food and trust our intuition about food because of the diet dogma, nutrition research culture that we literally are making some crazy decisions like thinking that um you know like believing this recent study out of Tufts University that was funded by the NIH that says that Lucky Charms are healthier than eggs. And so
Mm,
biggest thing I would tell people is like one of the things we need to do in our lives around food is basically create the enough time and space in our lives through boundary setting and saying no and rest to be able to energetically connect with our food. Like
mm,
really be with it. Because when you look at food in front of you and really experience it, look at it, smell it, you know what's healthy and what's not. You know. And everything in our culture has made us try and basically forget that we actually know what feels good. If we tune into our body awareness after a meal, we can see how we feel. But if we're constantly rushing to the next thing, we don't feel it. We don't,
that's right. That's
we
right.
just run through it.
That's
So you
right.
just don't
Yeah.
even sense it. And so part of slowing down, part of rest is being able to hear our body, which is constantly talking to us, especially around food. But when I sit down in front of like a gorgeous, you know, raspberries or a purple cauliflower or a watermelon radish or wild caught salmon with the silvery scales still on it. When I sit down with that and I look at that on my counter coming home from the farmer's market, on the energetic level, I am blissful, I am joyful, I am appreciative, I am grateful. I know that's going to be good for my body. When I sit down with a box, with a bag of Lay's potato chips or Fritos, it's just so clear that I don't want to be artificial. I want to take on the qualities of my food. It is going to be the thing that powers my life force. So if I can look at the food and understand its qualities and then determine what I want to become, which is vibrant and juicy and full of life and, you know, variegated colors and eccentric, then obviously I know which food I'm going to choose. Versus if I eat goldfish from a bag, that's just what is that? It's homogeneity, it's sterilization, it's lifeless. I don't want to be that. So take the time, set the boundaries to connect energetically with your food. Everyone listening knows what's healthy and does not need 50 nutrition studies to tell them. So that's just a message that I hope is empowering. But the 6 principles of healthy eating that I put forward in the book are: one, we need to remember that food determines the structure of our cells and the structure of our microbiome. Two, eating is the process of matching cellular needs with oral inputs. That's what eating is. That leads into principle 3, which is food is how you communicate with your cells. Food is a language in which we speak to our cells so they know what to do to give us the happiest, healthiest life possible, because they're just waiting to give us
Mm,
bliss,
yeah.
but we have to communicate with them properly to help them do that.
Mhm.
Principle 4 is that extreme food cravings are feedback. They are feedback from our cells that we are giving those cells mixed messages. We're not telling them whether we've eaten or whether we've not eaten. We're not giving them the information to let them know we don't need more food, so they generate hunger. Principle 5 is to ignore diet philosophies and simply focus on nutrient dense real food. And principle 6, which I think is the most important, is find awe in food. And that kind of gets into everything we've talked about already on this conversation, is like really understand what it is. It's a messenger from the cosmos to basically both fuel our life force, but also 3D print the next version of our bodies. And that's just really awe-inspiring. So so those are sort of the frameworks that I really think about with food. And I think to just boil it all down, when we the only thing that the real takeaway of like what to do is to do whatever you can to find and consume largely unprocessed real food grown from thriving good soil. And the reason for this is because when food is unprocessed and grown in good soil, there are going to be so many more helpful food molecules in it that are going to communicate with your body on essentially how to be healthy and tell you, help express the genes that are going to help you be healthy. So if we simply focus on unprocessed food grown in healthy soil, we are basically loading our body with information that's going to make it less hungry, more healthy. It's going to make you happier. It's going to feed your microbiome, which is going to make your microbiome makes the neurotransmitters that help us feel content and happy and peaceful and sleep well. And so a question that will always come up is, well, that seems hard and it seems more expensive. And I think that just sort of the reframe that we all need to make is really trying to think about that longer game. Like if you can help your body express health, we are ultimately in the long run, I believe, saving more time, more money, more hardship. And it is probably the highest yield investment that we can possibly make to ultimately ultimately have the most productive life possible on any level, on any dimension that you care about. And there's unfortunately there's just really no way to get around that. Mm, food is what becomes our brain cells. It's what determines our microbiome function, our neurotransmitters. And so we have to prioritize it on our journey towards um, our
Yeah.
happiest and healthiest self. Yeah.
And I think there's an importance in learning how to grow our own food,
Yes.
even if we don't have a lawn, to grow a few things on our patio so that we know where the food is coming from.
Yeah. Yeah. A book that I love is by Sean Stevenson. It's called The Eat Smarter Family Cookbook. And Sean is an incredible person. He has the Model Health Show, which is a top health podcast. But he really breaks down a lot of the concepts we're talking about today, but how to do it in a way that is economical, that is straightforward and easy. And he makes a point that I think is really important in there as well, which is it's not just about the food we're eating, but it's also how we're eating it, who we're eating it with. And some really interesting studies have come out that show that if you if you eat with people that you trust and that you care about, the food is actually digested differently. And that may be because of the way that our essentially like our hormones and our mood and our mindset actually affect our digestive function, the way our gut motility is, the nervous system state that we're in, whether we're in rest or digest or fight or flight. It even impacts the microbiome's activity, like our mood and our mindset. And so if if the idea of changing how you cook or what you buy is seems overwhelming, a first step that you can do is actually just try to eat more meals with people that you care about. And so that is just one thing that I find absolutely fascinating, that there seems to be quite an impact of how we eat on metabolism as well. And so that's something that's potentially like free and fairly effortless to incorporate. But inviting people over, if you live alone and inviting a friend over for a meal and sharing it, you're going to eat slower. You're probably going to be in a better mood.
Yeah.
It might inspire you to want to cook a little bit more involved. And so I will be totally honest. I was living in Bend, Oregon for a couple years alone and learning more about a lot of this stuff about the importance of really eating with people.
Mm.
It's one of the reasons I moved to LA, where much more people that I know are, because it was just like, I can certainly invite people over to my house in Bend, but I didn't know as many people. And I want to be somewhere where this is just more easy. And it has had a profound impact on my life to just share more meals with other people. So that's
I'm
another
so
important.
glad that you shared this because my next question was, can you talk about how community it directly impacts our health? And I think that that's such a beautiful thing to share meals with people who you love and people who you care about.
Mm,
Anything else that you want to let us know about the value of community and how it relates to our health?
yeah. So there was actually a really interesting study that talked about the mitochondrial impact of loneliness. So actually, how is our metabolic function, the structure and function of our mitochondria, directly related to our sense of community versus loneliness? And it's just a beautiful paper that basically outlines the many different ways in which social loneliness essentially crushes the ability of our mitochondria to do that metabolic work. And I think that we can really think about community and cultivating community, which is work. It's an investment we have to do. Um, and there's barriers to it, of course, our computers, COVID, social isolation, all of the things. Um, Loneliness and aloneness is a primitive fear signal. It is probably one of the biggest fear signals that the human body can experience because, thinking back to the ancestral days, it's like if you were alone, you were so much more at risk for being picked off by an animal and by basically being killed or dying. Like it is a survival threat to be alone. And that's hardwired into our biology. We're social creatures. That's just the reality of our biology, and our cells are expecting certain cues and signals, and when they don't get them, they express fear. And so for humans, whether we like it or not, chronically being alone, especially if it's not something that we're necessarily choosing, like we feel like it's something that's just like our lot in life, that is a primitive fear signal. The way this relates to metabolism, I think, is so interesting because anything that we experience as fearful in the body, of which loneliness and isolation is one, will express itself biochemically in our body as inflammation. Inflammation is the immune system revving up a response to something it perceives as a threat. And inflammation is very, very hard on the body because it's essentially a way of waging a war against something in the body. And theoretically, if it were a bacteria or a cut or something like that, you would address it and then it would be done. And the chronic inflammation would, quell, and it would go back, those immune cells would go back to the lymph
Mhm.
nodes and back to the bone marrow and everything would simmer down. And all the toxic stuff that they're spewing out to essentially fight would all go away and clean up, and you'd go back to just a state of rest in the body. But when the fear signals never go away, like in this state of, you know, every night we're not sleeping enough, and every day we're not seeing enough people in our community, and we're having days on end where we're not having a meaningful connection in person with another person, then that fear signal is basically always there. And the immune system, therefore, will not stop. It will keep spewing out its toxic, warlike chemicals in the body, fighting something that it actually can't get rid of, because the thing that it's fighting is outside of you. It's an environmental factor. So these immune cells that absolutely can engulf a bacteria and kill it and move on, they cannot, they can't get you to go hang out with people you care about. They can't take the donut out of your hands. They can't force you off the couch while you're scrolling on your phone to go to sleep. So they are impotent in the face of the threat signals of the modern world. And that's why chronic inflammation is just happening all the time. And the way it relates to metabolism is that these cytokines, these immune chemicals that are spewed out from these immune cells, block what's called insulin signaling, which is the way that essentially cells open up channels on their cell membrane to let food nutrients in to be processed and metabolically processed into energy. So if you think about this flow here, it's loneliness or social isolation or any other fear signal from our environment, which would be like ultra processed foods with artificial synthetic toxins and chemicals on it, sleep deprivation, sedentary behavior, not getting enough sunlight. These are all signals to the body that something's wrong, essentially, in the environment. Translates into immune system activation that actually is trying so hard to help you, but can't, because these things are outside your body. It's not a bacteria that's inside the body, it's outside the body. Spewing toxic chemicals that can be helpful in the short term, but are very damaging, collateral damage in the long term, that blocks your cells from taking up energy and turning it into cellular energy. And therefore, you get dysfunctional cells that aren't powered to do their work properly, which can look like depression, migraines, aches and pains, gout, infertility, erectile dysfunction, ultimately in the long run, Alzheimer's, dementia, cancer, obesity, type 2 diabetes, chronic liver disease, chronic kidney disease, et cetera, et cetera. So long story short, when it comes to community or anything in our quote unquote wellness journey or wellness behaviors, it's really about how do we create a sense of safety for the body so that everything can calm down inside the body and rest. So therefore we can have an unbridled flow of energy through our cells to power our lives. And so I think one of the key things we have to do as humans is look at our lives and very honestly take stock of what are the signals that my body could be perceiving as a threat across every
Mm,
dimension of our life, from relationships that could either be isolation or it could be toxic relationships that are also like people in our lives that are
yes,
causing stress
yes.
and that are
Mhm.
causing us problems. Where are you not setting enough boundaries? You know, two is obviously the food.
Mm.
Is the food nutrient poor because it's ultra processed? Is it covered in toxins like artificial colors and pesticides and preservatives? Look at sleep. How is the quality, quantity, and consistency of your sleep? All
Mhm.
things that are important for sleep. How is your movement? Sitting is actually an inflammatory signal on the body.
Yeah.
So, are we moving? Looking at temperature, looking at toxins in the environment, all these different things. So, I have some quizzes in the book that are essentially like looking at your life and taking stock at what the potential fear triggers could be, because anything that essentially causes, you know, a sense of threat in the body can fundamentally channel into metabolic dysfunction. And certainly community, I think, is one that we have under recognized, but that is a big one, because we are our deep, deep, deep part of our brain sees isolation as a survival threat.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for that. That gives us a lot to think about. So this book is coming out in May, right? And what's the actual date that the book comes
May
out?
14th.
May 14th. Amazing. I definitely am looking forward to finishing the read because I got it a couple of days ago. One thing I want to acknowledge is that you dedicated the book to your mother, And so anything you want to say
Mm,
about her?
mm. Yeah, the book is dedicated to my mom, Gail, who died unfortunately about 3 years ago, from pancreatic cancer, which is like many cancers, a cancer that is directly related to and accelerated by metabolic dysfunction. And this book is in her honor because I think she really had a very prototypical American health experience, which is that she, at age 40, like she had babies late, and in when she had her babies, she had very, very large babies. I was almost 12 pounds. My brother was 11.5 pounds. Everyone just said, "Oh, that's so great that you had big babies." She couldn't lose the baby weight. Her blood sugar started going up. Ultimately, she had high cholesterol. Ultimately, she had high blood pressure. Meanwhile, she looks great, so everyone's sort of saying, "Oh, you're fine." She's seeing different specialists. They're all giving her different medications. She's taking them faithfully. She's reading books about nutrition, but nothing's quite working. And then all of a sudden, she's 72 and she wakes up and has pain in her stomach, and she goes to the doctor, and they say, "Oh, we might as well do some imaging," gets a CT scan, and she had stage 4 widely metastatic pancreatic cancer. And 13 days later, she was dead. And at that time, she was seeing doctors at Mayo Clinic for these different chronic illnesses, oh, just lots of people have high blood pressure, how lots of people have high blood sugar, take this pill, take this pill. She was seeing doctors at Stanford. So best, quote unquote, best hospitals in the world. And everyone in that system, including her, thought they were doing the right thing. She was taking her pills, she was going for her checkup, she was going for her follow-ups, and then she gets, a death sentence with pancreatic cancer, and everyone calls it unlucky. But the reality is it wasn't unlucky at all. All of this is predictable and understandable through a metabolic lens, and I think all of it was preventable and reversible through a metabolic lens. But our country is practicing medicine antithetical to a metabolic lens because we are just obsessed with the cult of specialization. Every year we get more medical specialties. We have over 40 medical specialties, and outcomes are getting worse every year. We spend
Mm.
more money, outcomes are getting worse. We do more exercise and nutrition studies, outcomes are getting worse because we are totally pointing the arrow in the wrong direction. And so that is my mission in life, to honor her through helping to both empower people, but also shift the healthcare system towards the right target, which is on the clinical level, metabolism, and on the deeper level, an understanding of our interconnectedness with everything else in the universe and our limitless nature as transformers of light as humans. And so that's really what this book is about. And it's my greatest wish is that it can inspire people to feel more in touch with a sense of real deep awe at this beautiful mystery of being alive.
Thank you so much, Dr. Casey Means. Thank you so much for being
Thank
here and
you.
sharing. It's been an honor.
Thank you, Tracy.